I can't tell you what an honor and a privilege it is to be preaching here today, to be leading our services. Over the past year since my family moved to Augusta, Holy Comforter has truly become a wonderful church home, and we've made so many good friends here. And now to be invited to preach is wonderful. Now turning to our homily for today. In our gospel reading for today, and in fact, the story that comes before and after, Jesus takes a very strange route in his travels. It would be as if we got into a car today, and in order to drive to Charleston, we decided to drive to Greenville by way of Atlanta, then south to Macon, then back to Augusta, and then on to Charleston. That kind of route doesn't make a lot of sense unless perhaps you are traveling with the bishop on his pastoral visitations and he's gotten a bit lost. Or another reason might be because you're in the car with the bishop and you've decided to go out of your way for a particular reason. In today's gospel reading, Jesus has a similar route in northern Israel. He's traveling all around the region of Galilee where he's been living and working with the disciples. And where he's eventually going to end up is Jerusalem. And yet today, for some strange, inexplicable reason, Jesus will go completely out of his way to the place called Tyre, to a Gentile region. Now that kind of route only makes sense if A, you are avoiding soldiers who recently have arrested John the Baptist, your good friend, cousin, and fellow worker in the ministry of being a prophet and a healer and a teacher and a rabbi. John the Baptist, as we saw in the past a couple of weeks ago, was executed. And so Jesus may have that on his mind. We don't know. Or B, which I think is probably the more likely explanation, the reason for Jesus' strange decision to take this turn out of the way, is because the story wants us to understand something about Jesus' gospel. It has something to do with going to places we would not expect, about being with people that maybe we wouldn't expect God's grace extending to. And the intriguing thing about this gospel reading, as we will see in a moment, is that not only is this point being conveyed to us, but it seems that Jesus' own view of his mission is expanding as well. I think it's important to look at the context of where this story falls a little bit more in order to better understand it. We saw a couple of weeks ago that Jesus took a few loaves and a few fish. He broke those loaves, blessed them, distributed them, and gave people signs of hope. These people were hungry, not only for food, but for signs of hope and God's grace, and Jesus gives it, and he gives it abundantly. It's a message for us as well, that God's abundance, God's grace overflows to us more than we could ever ask or imagine. And then Jesus sends us forth to be his messengers of grace as well. So this passage is shortly before the passage that we have today. And then after this passage, Jesus will do it again. There will be more bread and fish that will be multiplied among thousands of people, another sign of God's abundance, that this abundance of God's grace is so intrinsic to the gospel. So today's reading, in which Jesus talks about bread falling from the table, is part of the artistry, I believe, that is so interwoven into this passage that we start with loaves and fish multiplied. We hear about a table overflowing beyond where we would imagine, and then we end with loaves and fish as well. Another sign of God's abundance, that this abundance is just so overflowing and so extending so far beyond where we would ever imagine. That said, we also have to recognize that this particular passage that we read about today is a difficult one for us to grapple with. And, you know, there's just no way to avoid that fact. It would be simple, it would be an easier thing for a preacher to do, to maybe preach on a different passage, or to try and pretend that this is not such a difficult passage. But the truth is that it is hard, because Jesus does not seem in this passage to be as kind and compassionate as we understand normally Jesus to be. In this passage, Jesus responds to a woman in need, and he says, it's not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. It's a harsh statement for sure. And we may try and figure out, well, perhaps this wasn't as unkind as it sounds, but in reality it really was. In ancient times, being called a dog was probably more offensive than it is today. Today, when we think of dogs, we might think of cute, fluffy puppies. But in the ancient world, dogs were understood to be scavengers. They were therefore unclean animals. We see that in the Old Testament in the way that dogs are portrayed. They lived outside of cities. They were not what we think of dogs today, pets and lovable animals. So when Jesus uses this term, he seems to be using a term that would be an insult for sure. That said, I think it's also important to point out something else about this passage, because there's something going on here as well, a dynamic between the region that Jesus comes from, of Galilee, and the region of Tyre where he has gone to. Galilee was largely rural, and the people there grew food that was often the food for people in the urban region of Tyre. Tyre was far wealthier compared to the region of Galilee. And so there was this socioeconomic tension there in this relationship between these two peoples. You can see how that for hungry people in the region of Galilee, people who couldn't afford the same food that they were growing, for the people in Tyre, that there would be this tension between Jews and non-Jews. So when Jesus speaks, therefore, about the unfairness of taking the children's bread and giving it to Gentile dogs, there must have been something of that there as well. Understanding that context and all of that is helpful, I think. But it still doesn't resolve the problem. It still doesn't give us a magic wand to wave over this passage. And if this is challenging to our perception of Jesus, of what it means for him, I'm not going to be able to give us a magic bullet to take away that challenge. But I will say this. I think it's a good reminder to us that Jesus is not only affirmed by the church and by Christians to be fully God, but also fully human. And if he is fully human, then he has emotions the same as we do. And he can identify with us fully in that full humanity in that way. And as someone with emotions, as any of us are, when he, as we see throughout the Gospels leading up to this passage and beyond it, he's going to be pulled in many different directions. He's going to be overwhelmed and overstretched. And he, like any of us, may have a bad day, especially at the end of a long day, like in this passage when he's finishing a day of teaching and ministering, even arguing and fighting with the Pharisees. Excuse me. Clearly, this is a story of two people having a messy interaction on both sides, one with emotions on both sides. It's very real and human, and therefore it is easy for us to identify with, I think. On the one side, we see a woman, a mother with a very sick daughter. And out of that passionate love that she has for her child, she is going to go to extraordinary lengths to try and help her. Anyone could surely relate to that love, that passion, having a family member feeling desperate for their care. This woman is so desperate that she is willing to even break her culture's rules about encounters between women and men. She shouts not only at a man, but at a rabbi. And then she goes even beyond that. When he doesn't respond to her, she throws herself at his feet when he ignores her. But even beyond that, she is willing to argue with Jesus. She puts herself, and this can't be overstated, she puts herself at risk of horrible consequences in her culture. She, though, is fearless out of her love and passion and faith. And faith. A Gentile woman in this story is the one who is the hero. It can be so easy to miss that, especially as we maybe even focus so much on Jesus' response, his strange, uncharacteristic response, that we miss the fact that in this story, the hero is this woman of great courage and great faith. She takes for granted that Jesus will be merciful to her in the end. And she will not give up. Even the dogs get the crumbs on the floor, is her witty reply to Jesus. In a way, this story is another Good Samaritan story. It's a story where the surprising person is the hero. The surprising person is the one who gets it. The surprising person is, in this story, this woman. And what is so amazing is that she opens the eyes of Jesus to the fact that his mission is expanding. This is an important hinge point in this story. Up until this point, clearly from what Jesus says in the text of this story, he does not believe that his mission extends beyond the people of Israel. It's only at this point that he realizes, as he sees this woman, he sees her love, that he sees that she, of course, is a child of God like anyone else. Therefore, how could his mission be limited? How could it not extend to her? How could it not extend to the whole world? And so the gospel will spread. Christ's mission will spread to all people throughout the world. The reading challenges us to ask, who is our neighbor? We're bombarded with images and words in our culture that would have us be divided, that would have us be afraid of one another, fear of the other, whatever the other may be, the other race, the other gender, the other denomination, the other political party. You all know what I'm talking about. We can get so tribal sometimes. The gospel is the most radical, inclusive, reconciling, amazing counter-response to that. The gospel is rooted in Our salvation, in fact, I believe, is rooted in ministry to and relationship with the other, bridging those divisions. The question is, where are we being called to move beyond the boundaries? We're all on our own journey, of course, just like Christ was on his journey to Jerusalem. Our journeys are good. We have individual callings in our jobs, in our families, in our loving relationships with people that have been put into our lives. Those are all so good. And only you can know the answer to this in your own prayer life. But I believe that Jesus, in those times, will call us to make a right turn and to go to Tyre. Where is that Tyre for you in your life? Where are you being called to witness to his love in your life, either with words or with actions? I'm sure that many of you have had the grace-filled experience that I have of doing prison ministry. I'll always remember the first time I entered a prison. I was visiting an inmate with whom I had had a long correspondence I guess we had been writing to one another for about a year. As I walked down that long corridor of the prison and I heard the gates clanging behind me, I tried to suppress the panic I felt inside. I knew that I would be locked into a small room with someone who had committed a violent crime. And sure enough, I was locked into this room and I saw my friend for the first time, and I stuck out my hand. But before I knew it, he had me in a bear hug. That simple gesture was instrumental in my life, in my own growth. And he had done a terrible thing for which he felt deep regret. But I quickly came to know him as not the worst thing that he had ever done, that no one was beyond God's grace, that no one was beyond the ability to grow. And no longer could I define him by my own prejudice of people in prison. Into that space, God's grace, God's healing grace could come for him and for me.